Hello, my name is Nele, and this is the Nele podcast. Today is Monday, 24th of February, 2025, and this is a special episode. Let's call it that. Ranting might also be a good word. But let's go with special episode of if crafting is hereditary. So, I'm working on a blanket on the go as well because it helps me focus. So if you've been crafting for any length of time, you will start getting comments that I would love to learn to craft, but I don't have a crafty gene in me. Well, I have a good news for everyone who has ever found themselves saying that. Crafting is not hereditary. You don't need to have a single crafting gene in your body to actually craft. Crafting is a skill that you obtain and you learn through practice. There are definitely genes that can affect your possibilities in crafting, but they are also genes that will affect your possibilities of learning other skills with your hands. They are similar to learning disabilities, so you can have a disability of sort of like, what is it now called? You can't picture things in the sense that you could make them. I think it's one of those things that in The Simpsons, always good to reference The Simpsons. Lisa Simpson is saying in one of the Christmas episodes that I think Bart gets a very poorly wrapped gift, and he makes a snarky comment of it to Lisa, and then she says nothing is easy for me, using scissors is difficult, or something in line of that. And of course, if you have issues with that kind of things, it can affect your possibilities of learning to craft. It's not, however, preventive. You can still learn to craft. You just need different sort of learning materials. You learn different. You need different sorts of teaching how to craft, but it doesn't actually prevent you from crafting. And in that kind of cases, it might be better to select a craft where you can do more bigger lines kind of thing, like punch needle or macrames or something like that. So it's not a sort of like, it's not preventive. It just needs different style of learning, different style of teaching. I think sort of like, because as I said, crafting is a skill. Now, when we would be talking about playing a violin or playing ice hockey or singing or baking or whatever, so we don't assume that the people can learn these things just, like this. Somehow crafting is one of those things that we're supposed to be learning like this. And it's really problematic because crafting is a skill that you learn by practicing. Of course, it helps if you have people around you who do crafts, because then you see the crafting itself. You see them fail, you see them try again, you see them plan, you see them look for patterns, you see them wondering how to solve these issues. You see them making and setting the example, which of course makes it then easier. Not always. But sort of like, craftiness helps. it also helps on getting on those first steps because the materials are most likely there. So you don't need to take the first step. Go to the store and buy the materials. But you can sneak into your mom's or your grandma's or your father's or grandfather's or whoever's stash. Material supply, I don't like to use the word stash. To try it. You can ask the person to show you how to do it. Now, of course, it's no secret that my mom cannot teach me a thing. My grandma, however, can. So there are things that sort of like, it's always good to remember that it's not necessarily either one of your fault. It's just that the learning and the teaching mechanisms can be different. And it's one of those things that usually when it is a parent who is trying to teach the child to do something that they think so obvious, so it can be difficult to, set yourself in the position of how did I learn this as a child. So there is no shame on, finding someone else to teach you these things if it doesn't work out with your parents. It's also no secret that I've grown up in a crafting family. So my mom does knitting, my mom does did machine embroidery, not any longer. She does crochet. She did sew a lot of clothes to me and my brother when we were smaller. So it's crafting has always been part of my life, let's put it that way. My father is a very crafty person. He's a mason by profession. And he's a handyman. So, and I think sort of like, actually, when I was a child, my father sewed himself a full outfit. Trousers with several pockets. A fishing style vest with several pockets. And a jacket and a hat to go with that. He sewed them all to himself in over a week or so with my mom's sewing machine. So of course it helps. And when I started to sort of like wanting to do, this is one of those really odd things because in Finnish, upholstery sort of like covers all things you do basically to furniture. So I've repainted one of my cupboards and my kitchen table. My kitchen chairs are still waiting for that, and possibly the table will be redone at the same time again. But sort of like when I started to do woodwork, so he was always very supportive on telling himself like, yeah, this is how you are supposed to be doing it. I didn't always listen, but sort of like he was always just there to give the advice and tell how I could do this better. So it was a big deal to have that support. And sort of like having the example helps because, as I said, you have the possibilities, you have the materials, you have the support net, so you can ask for help. But it's one of those things also that we have this odd general belief that pre-boomers, everyone was good at crafting. Everyone had to do crafting to, keep themselves clothed, keep themselves eating, keep their houses, in order. So basically, well, it's not. I would say that the greatest generation, the lucky few, are the real cutoff. But of course, it would depend very much where in the world you find yourself. I'm an older millennial, and I've still learned, I've still grown in home sewn clothes when it was definitely not in fashion. And I've learned countless things that I did not think at a time that they were somehow odd or special. But when I'm then comparing what others of my age know or can do, there are certain things like using an axe. Yeah, I've held an axe for the first time in my life, like when I was 10 or 11. So, it's just part of how I've been brought up. But it's also one of those things that it's whether or not I or my family has chosen to, it is something that has happened. So there are variation between the generations when these kind of things have died out or have been managed or have been possible to leave out. Um, my four great grandmothers, so they were born between 1907 and 1921, and three of them have done crafts. The fourth one probably has done some crafts, but every story I've heard of her pretty much starts with she did not do crafts or she hated crafts. So, and she would have been part of the lucky few generation, basically. So, it's one of those things that the belief that all of our foremothers and all of our forefathers were really good at crafts. No, they weren't. They did crafts because they had to. And I think there's a very big difference between the older generations and sort of like with our generation, and especially with the younger generations. Then again, how do we see crafts? It's it's one of those things that, so this is a freshly spun bobbin, and well, this is a freshly fixed flyer, which my dad did for me over the weekend because I've been complaining and I wanted to test it out. So, my great grandmothers and their mothers, so to them, spinning would have been mandatory. Spinning would have been done something that would have been done all the time when there was free moment, because the wool was needed for clothing, it was needed for bed linen, it was needed for a lot of things. And doing something like this, which quite frankly I was just, watching television and having fun with it. So I think my great grandmothers and their mothers would be telling me, yeah, no, you can't spin yarn like this because it's thick. There is also some parts where there is crazy over twist, but I hope that will be fixed when I ply it. So, so, um, so the skill is different, and I think, for example, in hand spinning, there is a lot of movement to spinning art yarn, and there is a place for art yarn, definitely, and there are some art yarn techniques I would love to learn for the sake of learning the techniques. Personally, I don't like a lot of art yarns because they're difficult to work with. So in art yarns, it would be more the how you make them than have them. And because we don't need to do the crafts ourselves, we can also position ourselves differently towards the crafts. Of course, there is the whole movement to slow fashion, which is definitely a good thing, and we definitely need slow fashion movement. But it's also in a sense that we don't have to. And I think this is a key component when we are talking about learning a skill. So I was teaching somebody to knit recently, and they made a hat and they made a scarf out of a very thick woolen yarn. And they were really excited and sort of like, yeah, now I'm going to start knitting socks. And they went from like, super bulky, almost pencil roving type of a yarn to 6-ply sock yarn. And from 10mm needles to 3mm needles. I think most of you know where this is going. So the socks, which were casted on, I think in October, have probably been much done. So, and it's completely fine. It's completely okay to have all of your knitting career to focus on pencil roving kind of a yarn, hats and scarves, and possibly a pair of mittens occasionally with like 8mm needles. So, sort of like, because we don't have to think about, okay, next winter is going to be cold, I need to have wool socks to wear. Next winter is going to be cold, I need to have this and that. We can still go and buy those things from a secondhand store or from a clothing store or supermarket. Yes, you can buy clothes in supermarkets in Finland. So we see crafting very differently to how our foremothers and forefathers saw crafting. To them, it was necessity. It was something that they would be doing. There was always something to whittle. There was always something that needed a little bit of fixing. There was always mending. There was always spinning. There was always filling bobbins, building warps, doing this and that. And we don't have to do any of those things. We can do crafts because we like them, and thus we can select the crafts we like and we want to make. So it's not mandatory in a sense. Now, this coming from a person who is, well, officially I'm going to graduate as a crafting teacher, and crafting is a subject they teach in Finnish schools. So, and then I said, yeah, it's not mandatory. Well, yeah, it's mandatory to learn some basics of crafting in elementary and secondary schools in Finland. And, but that's not sort of like, there is a lot of discussion around the topic. So when the crafts were still divided according to gender, so girls were taught textile crafts and boys were taught technical crafts. Some schools have allowed at some points, that girls can also go technical crafts and boys can also go textile crafts, but the peer pressure to do that has actually been always very strong that, you're not supposed to. I've been in primary education sort of like most of the 90s. I've started my school journey in 1993. And I was twice told in the primary education that I cannot do technical crafts. The first time was on 3rd grade, when the first school where I went to elementary school to had the separation of genders for crafting and sports. And this was done so efficiently that in my year, the girls' crafts was at the same time as boys' sports was. And then girls' sports was when boys' crafts was. So you physically couldn't go to boys' crafts if you were a girl. And then I transferred to a different school because we moved when I was on a third grade. Uh, on a fifth grade at another school. So there was again this sort of like, yeah, you're supposed to be going to textile crafts or technical crafts based on the gender. And there was, I think, two other girls and myself who would have wanted to take the technical crafts, partially because the textile crafts teacher we had was, if I say horrible, I'm not very far, but I also do not like describing person as a horrible. So if I say she was old fashioned and she was very strict on her ways, you might gather the horrible between there. So, but we were told plainly that nobody's going to teach girls to knit in senior school, so you have to go to textile crafts. That's it. Well, come the 7th grade and the secondary school, guess what crafts I studied? Technical crafts. So I transferred schools from the intended secondary school to the actual secondary school where I started in 7th grade. And the form I had to fill in to transfer schools was like, it asked my name and my social security and address and my parents' name and that sort of stuff. Then there were the selectables. Am I going to be studying Lutheran, Orthodox, or the non-religious studies for religion? At a time, there was no other options, but these days, of course, there are more options. If you are a member of certain churches, you have to study the Lutheran or the Orthodox or whatever the selections are. And then if you are not, and the municipality is not providing according to your own religion, then you are studying the non-religious religious studies. It asks which languages I'm studying, like, the A1 language, which is English, and if I have an A2 language, if I'm going to be starting the B1 language according to the law, which is Swedish, and then sort of like if I aspire to take a B2 language, which would start then on an 8th grade. And then it asks textile crafts, technical crafts. And that was sort of like, yep, I'll tick a box for technical crafts. Nobody ever asked me a question about that. None whatsoever anywhere. So most of the time of the secondary school, I had no idea where the textile crafts class was. And I think it was on 9th grade, then when one of my dear friends, so she was taking the optional textile crafts, and their lessons always ran much longer than ours. So I learned where the textile crafts class was, so I could go and hang out there until she was done. But that was the biggest experience I had in textile crafts in all of secondary school. So it's not mandatory per se to learn to do certain things. So I think the law changed shortly after I've graduated from sort of like secondary education, or the mandatory education. And it started to say that boys and girls should learn both textile crafts and technical crafts. And there was for a while, so that you would have like half and half. And now it's so that there is basically it's half and half, but it's not also gender divided any longer. So on a class there are both girls and boys, and those who would not prefer not to be either, all mixed, and they study roughly half a year of textile crafts and roughly half a year of technical crafts. Some schools have done it so that on the 7th you have textile crafts and on 8th you have technical crafts, or vice versa. And there are various methods of how you do this, but there are a lot of very sort of like that's the principle. And that has led to a lot of discussion on what skills the students or the pupils, when they go to the secondary school and they sort of like start to have serious crafts. So what skills they do have. And a lot of the older textile teachers, they say that, 10 years ago, most girls needed socks on their 8th grade as their final work. And these days they don't. Well, I would first of all like to see the statistics saying that the girls actually, majority of them knit socks 10 years ago. I don't believe in that. And second of all, it is also a thing that how do you support students to do that? We had a teaching practice a while ago, and there was a really small child who decided that they want to knit socks for their younger sibling. And I was like, yep, I'll go for it. This is the yarn, this is the needles, this is simple pattern, just go for it. And they did. So I think it's often that it's forgotten that crafting requires practice. Crafting requires a lot of motivation. And when we talk about learning crafts, learning new skills in general, it requires a lot of motivation. We talk in the public a lot about how young people stop doing sports when you're supposed to go serious. Well, I think there's a problem when you say that, sort of like when you're 13, 14, and you're supposed to go serious in sports. There are people who actually will make it into, National Hockey League, or who will be the world's best ski jumper or skier or whatever. Most of them are not going to be the world's best ones. So I think a lot of sports leagues sports teams would need to have that, yeah, we are going to keep up with this twice a week kind of a thing for you who are just interested to keep up with the sport. And then we have this 5 times a week kind of a thing for those whom you are aiming to become athletes. And somehow in crafts, we seem to think that if you dabble in crafts, you either are in or you're out. It's same in sports, it's same in music, it's same in almost all hobbies. That when you get older, you get sort of like you're supposed to get serious on it. Now, you really can't earn a living out of crafts. There's going to be somebody who say, yeah, it is possible, and I'm earning my living out of crafts as well. But sort of like making socks, no. Designing socks can actually give you not quite a nice living, but a decent living at least. But sort of like, again, it's not for everyone. And it's a really hard way of making a living. It's less risky on physical harm than, say, becoming an ice hockey player. But sort of like still, it's still a long way to go. But we need to motivate people to find the crafts that they like, that they enjoy, that they want to practice with. And it's definitely not going to be one of those ways that sort of like, your older sister could do this 10 years ago and you can't. Well, if the older sister has been teaching this thing to the people at home, they could. So the motivation is the key thing, and sort of like there is so much baggage that comes in the crafting. Uh, there are assumptions how good crafts look like. There are belief systems, and there are all sorts of traditions how you're supposed to be doing things. One of my favorite quotes in the world is that tradition is peer pressure from dead people. Now, coming from a person who does study, traditional crafts, of course, that's quite a bold statement. Uh, but sort of like, if we think that something is wrong because it's not how our foremothers would have done it, it's actually the type of a peer pressure that we don't need. The need for our clothing, the possibilities that we have with our clothing to play with statement pieces is very different to our foremothers and to our forefathers. Partially because, of course, we don't need to think about every single gram of wool we use. We don't even need to use wool, we can use all sorts of materials these days because, there is more possibilities in layering as well. And I think it's one of those things that, of course, as a crafting teacher and as a crafting researcher, it's very important for us uh, as a professional group to learn to support all sorts of ideas and all sorts of products and see if the knitted socks is still the staple that we compare to. Um, it's yeah. So crafting is not hereditary. I've said that several times already, and I still stick with it. Having crafters around you while deciding that you crafting might be something that you want to dabble into definitely helps. But that being said, everything that it doesn't matter how crafty family you have, it doesn't matter how crafty heritage you have, you still need to learn the skills. It takes roughly 10,000 hours to learn a skill. It doesn't matter what skill it is, whether it is playing violin, whether it is reading, whether it is a lot of other things. If you want to be good at something, it takes 10,000 hours to learn that. It transfers roughly 10 years. Um, that would sort of like indicate that when you're 11, you can actually run properly. Uh, so that's not quite how it goes because when you're learning to walk and when you're learning to control your body and when you're learning to run and jump and all of those things, you do them so much more than a assigned amount of hours a day or a week or a month. But when it comes to hobbies, so 10,000 hours, it takes 10,000 hours to do something properly. And I think as an adult, we tend to forget that. I know that when I'm doing a lot of crafting, it looks easy. And it's because I've done my 10,000 hours several times over. Uh, so, of course, it looks easy. And I think it's one of those things that in crafting, in many, especially in young crafts, there are some technical crafts, woodwork and metalwork, where you can where you can learn the basics in few hours. Of course, the risks are bigger because you're using bigger machines and bigger tools. But in young crafts, you can learn the basics of knitting, you can learn the basics of crocheting, you can learn the basics of weaving, you can learn basics of sewing in few hours, and then it is just building the skill. And I think a lot of times when people say that they don't have a crafty gene in them, it is actually experiences similar to what I had in primary education, uh, for the teacher to sort of like saying that, you're never going to learn how to craft kind of things. So it's the memories of being bad at crafts talking, not so much their not believing into their genes. Um, and I think, especially when we're talking about teaching adults to do crafts and getting interested in the crafts, it is often that that's the question that needs to be addressed. So, and I think it's one of those things that I've taught several adults to knit and few to crochet, and sort of like they are always so surprised when I say that, yeah, that's really good work. And that's one of those things that, because then they are comparing something simple that they've been making, and they compare something lace shawl that I'm wearing or something. And I actually try these days, when I go to events where I know I will be teaching new beginners. So I try to take a very simple project with me. So this is knit to purl 2. It has some increases. And basically, after you learn knit to purl 2, you can do something like this. You can make a hat, you can make a scarf, you can make a neck warmer, you can make a lot of things. So I think it is one of those things that can be encouraging to people when they are learning to craft, that they see that, okay, the basics are still basics. After 20 years of crafting, 20 years of knitting, quite literally, I still do things like knit to purl 2, or knit to purl 2 with the mistaken numbers. So the basics in knitting, the basics in crocheting, the basics in knoll binding, the basics in many crafts are the bread and butter. And then you have these laces and gables and color work and all of those things. And if you enjoy them, you can go on, learn them and make them, and learn from them, and eventually decide if you like them or not. Color work, yep, nope, not my piece of cake. And it's completely fine. You don't need to like everything within your craft. You don't need to learn everything within your craft. You can if you want to. If you want to stick with something that you already know, it's completely fine as well. It's a hobby. You don't need to be able to do everything in your hobby just to say that you can. If you want, you can. You sort of like, it's. I think it's one of the really important things that we, as a community, as well as sort of like as crafters, that we need to remember that every way of practicing the hobby is equally important and equally good, and thus allowing everyone to be what they are and practice their own way. Of course, if you come and ask, how do I do this, I will tell you. You might get a lecture on how all the other ways you can do this. Sorry. But it's one of those things that it's equally right to want to learn things than it is to just be happy with the, I know the basics, I'm going to practice on the basics. And also, sort of like finding the joy in the crafting is one of those really important things. So, I think this is where the belief that crafting is hereditary is actually working against itself. So, if we don't enjoy the crafting, and if we don't show the enjoyment of the crafts we are doing to the next generations, or if we as a children did not see that our mothers or fathers or grandmothers didn't enjoy crafting, that they did crafting because they had to. So of course it's not something that we are going to be taking up with. So I was talking about the matter with my goddaughter last year, and sort of like, because of course she has a crafting family as well, and sort of like we were talking about the possibilities that crafting, not necessarily as a skill or as a fixed skill, could offer, but sort of like if you have really good coordination between your brains, with your brain and your eyes and your hands, it helps in a lot of professions, like in medical professions, in veterinary professions. It helps playing music. It helps in a lot of professions to have that communication, sort of like coordination skills. And crafting is one of those things where you can learn those things. It is also one of those things that um, sort of like, because a lot of us do work in fields where we can't see the results of our work truly. So crafting tickles the right spots in our brains to actually have the feeling that I finished something. I did something, I'm good at this. So this is something I can touch. So it's also a very big part of why crafting is a great hobby. Similarly, baking can be a great hobby, or gardening can be a great hobby. There are a lot of good hobbies around the um, creative sphere, and I also think sort of like that it's important that we discuss of finding the right creative hobby when it is needed to teach all those skills and maintain all those skills, and also find your ways to support your mental health. Crafting is a very good for that. Again, because you can just focus on the yarn, you can just focus on your materials and your tools, and you can see the finished object eventually. Eventually, sometimes. As I said in the previous proper episode, I've been doing a lot of instant gratification projects lately because my brain needs them. My brain needs to be seeing me finishing things. So, and crafting is really great for that. Instant gratification projects. uh, I saw some dog families over the weekend, and my nose knows that. So when you're hearing somebody saying that they don't have a crafty gene on them, just, you know, find the right tone to laugh, the kind, and, tell them that crafting is a skill you need to learn, and show them how to get started. And then remember to support them. Remember to celebrate their small victories, especially the first finished object. And as I said, the motivation is important. So if you can, try to get them to select a craft and a pattern and a materials that they can actually finish. Don't get started with something that you know that it's nearly impossible to finish as a beginner. I had a thing at the couch which I have taken away apparently. I could have shown it to you as a good example, one not to start with. So find the good pattern with the right motivation, the right tool materials, the right colors, definitely the good tools. I know there's a lot of feeling that, if you're just trying, you can try with the poor tools or the ones you can find in a secondhand shop. Sometimes you can find excellent tools from a secondhand shop. I'm not saying that anything else, but also don't let them buy something that should have been put in a metal collection bin like 2 generations ago. That's going to kill the motivation, the tools itself. So, a lot of baby steps, a lot of small things, and it takes 10,000 hours to learn a skill. If you lock in those 10,000 hours, so I don't recommend counting. It's a lot of hours. And sort of like, it's a lot of work to learn a craft if you want to learn it more than just the basics, but just learning the basics and enjoying the basics is good enough. Well, I'm crocheting a granny hexagon kind of a thingy. It's triples. 3 triples, space. 3 triples and a space. And at the corners, 3 triples, 2 chains, and 3 triples. It is very basic thing. And I'm quite happy that sort of like to say that this is the level of crocheting competence I want to be at. I can do more intriguing things in crochet, but I don't enjoy it. So, it's fine. It's completely okay to know your limits and follow them. So, love your crafts, teach your friends, and also let them select the level of crafting they want to do. Yeah, this was my rambling of crafts, and it's Hereditary. It's not anything like I was planning to talk about, except the topic that it's crafting is not it's not Hereditary, and there might be similar babbling videos later on as well, because there's a lot of background that happens in the crafting. So sometimes I like to wait. Okay, I'll see you with the proper episode probably in 2 weeks' time, I think. Maybe 3 weeks' time, because I don't have almost anything to show you. But when I will have something to show you, I will record a proper podcast episode. See ya!